بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والجنة للموحدين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. All praise belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the choicest of blessings and salutations upon our master Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We continue inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala this afternoon with our 23rd class on the Umdah al Salik wa Umdah al Nasik of Sheikh Ahmad ibn Naqib al-Misri rahimahullah ta'ala. And classes 21 and 22 I recorded in the blessed city of Tarim, and I know most of you have not yet seen those classes. We do plan on uploading them in due time inshallah ta'ala. What we covered last in those classes was Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. We spoke about adab qada al-haja and different aspects related to that, and those recordings will be made available very soon. I'm not going to ask any questions about that class because most of you, in fact all of you, none of you have listened or seen them, but we will come back to ask questions as a revision in our next class inshallah ta'ala. In our 23rd class, today we continuing with the chapter on ghusl, babul ghusli. So I'm reading now from the Umdah al Salik, and or if I can ask perhaps one of our brothers to read from the Umdah al Salik at least a few pages, and then I'll advise where you should stop inshallah. Are there any volunteers? If there are no volunteers, then I will read inshallah. Do you have a text with you, Khalid? Student coming to the dars without the kitab. No. You have a cell phone, have you? Ghusl, babul ghusl.
باب الغسل إذا
نعم بسم الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. باب الغسل يجب على الرجل من خروج المني ومن إيلاج الحشفة في أي فرج كان قبلا أو دبرا ذكرا أو أنثى ولو بهيمة أو صغيرا في صغيرة، ويجب على المرأة من خروج منيها ومن أي ذكر دخل في قبولها أو دبرها ولو أشل، أو من صبي أو بهيمة، ومن الحيض والنفاس وخروج الولد جافا، وإنما يتعلق بتغييب جميع الحشفة، ولو رأى منيا في ثوب أو فراش ينام فيه مع من يمكن كونه منه ندب لهما الغسل، ولا يجب ولا يقتدي أحدهما بالآخر وإن لم ينم فيه.
ولا يجب. نعم. The pause has to be correct so the meaning comes out correct. ندب لهما الغسل ولا يجب. نعم. Then you go on. ولا يقتدي.
ندب لهما الغسل ولا يجب ولا يقتدي أحدهما بالآخر وإن لم ينم فيه غيره لازمه الغسل، ويجب إعادة كل صلاة لا يحتمل حدوث المني بعدها، لكن يندب إعادة ما أمكن كونها بعده، ولو جمعت في قبولها فاغتسلت ثم خرج منيه منها لازمها غسل آخر بشرطين. Continue.
نعم.
نعم. أحدهما أن تكون ذات شهوة لا صغيرة، الثاني أن تكون قضت شهوتها لا نائمة ومكرهة، ويعرف المني بتدفق.
إن شاء الله. So بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today I'm going to try a new approach in covering the masail over here. administration is putting a lot of pressure on me to cover more work in each class. And as much as I've been trying to leave out detail, I'm finding it challenging because the impetus within me keeps on saying that this is the Umdah. And within the madrasa of Ahl Hadramaut, Mashayikh in Hadramaut, the Umdah is taught on a detailed level. And I'm struggling to find a balance between the impetus in my heart regarding the way of our Mashayikh and the Habaib of Hadramaut and the expectations of administration here at Seekers Guidance. So we'll try to cover more work in less detail, and we see how that goes with the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he began by saying Babul Ghusli, the chapter that is dealing with ghusl. And the word ghusl sometimes can be read as al-ghuslu or al-ghaslu or al-ghislu, and each has a different, or some, so the meanings are all mutaqariba. So lughatan, it is preferred to say ghaslu over ghuslu. That's one meaning. Ghasl meaning is the masdar of ghasala, which means washing. Now, washing something or washing oneself. Yani ghasala or ightasala. However, the jurist, even though the preferred word would be ghasl instead of ghusl, when the word ghasl, which means washing, is a mudaf to something else. Now, in udifa ila sabab, if it is mentioned in relation to the cause or the reason behind the ghusl, then they prefer the usage of ghusl. By way of example, if a person is going to be doing a washing of Yawm al-Jumu'ah, then he will say Ghusl al-Jumu'ah. Or if he's going to be making a washing of his body, then he will say Ghusl al-Badani. Tamam? So the words are interchangeable. Also, I think in the urf of our scholars, the way the words are used is that ghusl will refer to a general washing of anything, whereas a ghusl would be more specific to a ritual bath. Now. However, so the way the fuqaha dealt with it, again, if I can just repeat myself to make myself clear in case I was not, when the word ghusl, which is washing, is attributed to a sabab of ghusl, a reason for you to take a shower, then they would say ghusl. So ghusl al-badan or ghusl al-jumu'ah and so forth and so on. However, if it is attributed to the washing of a garment or a table or a thawb or a carpet, then they would use the word ghasl. Then it would be so ghaslu thawbin أو غسل سجادة أو غسل أي شيء. أما بالنسبة إلى البدن أو سبب من أسباب الغسل فعند الفقهاء يعني يفضلون استعمال كلمة الغسل، غسل الجمعة أو غسل البدن أو غسل عيد وهكذا. يعني هذا بالنسبة إلى الغسل والغسل. أما الغسل فهو اسم لما يغسل به. اسم لما يغسل به. So something that you would use with water when washing. And the examples they would make is that when you washing the deceased, by way of example, they would add sidr. They would create a powder from the lotri that they would use to wash the bodies, and that is common in the valley of Hadramaut and lands where sidr, the lotri, is to be found in abundance. Many a times we would add camphor sometimes to the water. So that camphor or anything that is added to water with which you're going to wash, whether it's soap or the like, that is called al-ghisl. فهناك غسل وغسل وغسل. تمام. He said رحمه الله تعالى باب الغسل يجب على الرجل من خروج المني. يتحدث المصنف هنا عن ماذا؟ عن موجبات الغسل. يتحدث المصنف هنا عن موجبات الغسل، فبدأ بالرجل وقال يجب على الرجل، يعني يجب الغسل على الرجل من خروج المني. Sorry, before I get to that, I also want to discuss the شرعي meaning of غسل. So linguistically غسل أو الغسل، الغسل والغسل لغة هو سيلان الماء على جميع الشيء. سيلان الماء water flowing over an entire commodity. سيلان يعني غسل العمامة، سيلان الماء على جميع العمامة، هذا هو الغسل أو الغسل. نعم. أما شرعا فهو سيلان الماء على جميع البدن بنية. So the legal definition of غسل is سيلان الماء على جميع البدن بنية. نعم. And then author mentioned that ghusl is something that was known by previous nations, previous religions. Nabi Ibrahim and Nabi Musa and Nabi Isa thereafter, they were all familiar with the concept of ghusl, and they were all familiar with the concept of janaba, and the fact that if you are in a state of janaba, you have to perform ghusl. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not explain the ghusl in detail. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ جُنُوب. Allah just said junub because people understood the concept of janaba, entering into a state of janaba. فَطَهَّرُوا, then clean yourself. They knew that the way you clean yourself from janaba is ghusl. So ghusl was known in the Arab. Now, and therefore Abu Sufyan, when he took a vow to pledge war against the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a vow to wage war against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the occasion of Badr, he said that he took an oath, أَلَّا يَمَسَّ رَأْسَهُ مَاءٌ مِّن جَنَابَةٍ, that no water will touch his head on account of janaba until he fights the Prophet, حَتَّى يَغْزُوَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. Again emphasizing that ghusl was known by the Arabs. As for wudu, so that's hadath akbar. Amma al-hadath al-asghar, so that was not known by the Arabs. And therefore when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about hadath asghar and wudu, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala detailed it in the Quran. So what did Allah say? إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم من المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم من الكعبين. Because وإن كنتم جنبا فطهروا. You're in a state of janaba, then clean yourselves. They knew how to clean themselves from janaba, but wudu was من خصائص أمة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. تمام. يقول يتحدث هنا عن حكم الغسل فقال يجب، يتحدث عن موجبات الغسل فقال يجب على الرجل من خروج المني. أول سبب من أسباب وجوب الغسل هو خروج المني، يعني بالنسبة إلى الرجل والمرأة. خروج المني قال يجب على الرجل من، المراد بالرجل هنا ليس الرجل فقط بل المرأة كذلك. إذا خرج المني من امرأة فقد يجب عليها الغسل كذلك. نعم. ولو قطرة, if a person releases semen, money, even if it's a drop, في يقظة أو منام, whether he is awake or whether she is awake or asleep, then ghusl becomes wajib by consensus. Ghusl becomes wajib. نعم. Whether it happened through jima, which is conjugal sexual relations, or otherwise, it does not matter how a person releases money. If there's ejaculation, then ghusl becomes compulsory. وهذا مشترك بين الرجل والمرأة. يقول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الماء من الماء. إنما الماء من الماء. Who has heard that hadith before? نعم. So إنما الماء من الماء. الماء الأول يشير الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى الغسل. إنما الغسل من الماء. الماء الثاني معناه المني. إنما الغسل من خروج المني. هذا معنى قول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الماء من الماء. نعم. رواه مسلم. وأيضا as for a lady, رسول صلى الله عليه وسلم, سليم came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she said, Ya Rasulullah, inna Allah la yastahi min al-haqqi. Allah is not ashamed of the truth. فهل على المرأة من غسل إذا احتملت إذا احتلمت? Does a lady also have to perform a ghusl if she has a wet dream? So the Prophet ﷺ said, إذا رأت الماء, if she receives water, meaning money. إذا خرج منها مني, then she has to perform ghusl. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then another version of the hadith, Sulaim, she covered her face out of modesty, and she asked Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, does the lady have wet dreams? Does woman have wet dreams? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that taribat yaminuk fima fabima yushbihuha waladuha. How does her child resemble her? Now, in other words, it's the mixture of her money with that of a male, and part of her money is going to be the entire process of birth, and we can get into that at a later stage. Through that, her child resembles her. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Now, and in another narration, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, min al-madhi al-wudu wa min al-maniyi al-ghuslu. So whenever a person releases ejaculate, ghusl becomes compulsory, male or female. Now, then there's a discussion. What if the person's prior releases, because we had a discussion previously about the original places of the privates being blocked, and we spoke about what was it called now? Just give me a second. I'm just we spoke about suprapubic catheters, right? And whether the catheter is beneath the navel or above the navel, and rules. So similarly over here, there's a similar type of detail that is expressed over here by a jurist. When ghusl becomes compulsory, if the original privates are blocked or if they're not blocked, and if a person money comes out of a person in a non-normal sense, and where that hole may be. And I'm not going to get into that detail now because we are trying to cover more work, inshallah ta'ala. Now, so يجب على الرجل من خروج المني ومن إيلاج الحشفة في أي فرج كان قبلا أو دبرا ذكرا أو أنثى ولو بهيمة أو صغيرا في صغيرة. So there's a number of things. The second, السبب الثاني من أسباب موجبات الغسل وإيلاج يعني إدخال الحشفة. الحشفة هو رأس الذكر, the head of the male organ. If the head of the male organ enters the private of a female, then ghusl becomes compulsory. However, the farj, the private here, is not restricted to the private of a female. So he said, kubulan or duburan, whether it is the front private of a female or whether it is the backside, even though that is something which is haram within our sharia. Now, dhakaran or untha, whether it's the backside, now this would be of a male or a female, or even that of an animal, or even if it is a minor who inserts the head of his front private, his dhakar, into the farj of a young girl, a minor female. In all instances, if the head of the penis disappears inside a farj or a dubar of a dhakar or a untha, even that of an animal, bestiality, in all instances ghusl becomes wajib. Whether he ejaculates or not, ghusl becomes wajib. Our fiqh covers all these things, not that our fiqh is approving of any of it. It's just exhausting all possibilities. Bestiality is one of the kabair, one of the major sins. Now, However, our fiqh is covering it because this is the reality of man. And our fiqh doesn't leave anything to our imagination except that it covers and explains it for us. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, how do we know ghusl becomes compulsory? He said, إِذَا الْتَقَى الْخِتَانَانِ فَقَدْ وَجَبَ الْغُسْلِ. If the two places of circumcision meet, then ghusl becomes compulsory. The expression of Rasul ﷺ is interesting because what does iltiqa'u al-khitanaini, that meeting of the two places of circumcision, what does it mean? What does it mean? It means when the head of the male disappears into a private. That's what this means. Why? Because if the head of the penis was to not insert into the private of a female, but the places of circumcision meet or touch, then there's no ghusl. And therefore what is meant is not necessarily the meeting, the touching, but the passing. Because the reality is that even when there is intercourse, when the male organ inserts into that of the female, the places of circumcision are not really meeting. They are merely passing. Because the lady's place of circumcision is the upper part of the female private. And the area, the actual private where the male organ inserts, it's not necessarily coming in contact with the place of circumcision. But there's mujawaza happening. So if this is the place of circumcision of the female, and this is the place of circumcision which is the head of a male, even though they're not touching per se, the insertion is happening on a lower level. When that's mujawaza, when they come in line, then ghusl becomes compulsory. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she said, فَعَلْتُهَا أَنَا وَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ. Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and I had intercourse in that fashion without ejaculation, and ghusl became compulsory. Rasul sallallahu advised that ghusl becomes compulsory. Now, in another hadith, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, إِذَا جَلَسَ بَيْنَ شُعَبِهَا الْأَرْبَعِ, when a man sits between her four branches. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what that was referring to, he was referring to the saqain, which is the legs from the knee down to the ankle, and the fakhidain, which is the thighs. That was the shu'ab al-arba'a. ثُمَّ جَهَدَهَا, and then he has sexual relations with her. In short, that's what jahadaha mean. فَقَدْ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ الْغُسْلُ, ghusl becomes compulsory upon him. And then the Prophet said, وَإِلَّمْ يُنزِلْ, even if he does not ejaculate. So the male private inserting the female private, that is something that makes ghusl compulsory, and that has nothing to do with ejaculation. Ejaculation, khuruj al-mani was one cause, and then the insertion of the male organ into that of the female is a second cause. Whether he ejaculates or not, ghusl becomes compulsory. And then of course we heard and saw all the detail that our author mentioned, whether it's the farj, any farj it may be, whether it's a front private or back private of a male or a female, even that of an animal, and even for a minor. No. Even if the animal is not something that is desired. Irrespective of whether there's a covering over the male private or not, whether the covering is thin or whether the covering is thick. Even if that's the private of a mayit, of a deceased, ghusl still becomes compulsory upon the person, not upon the deceased, upon the other party. No. And ghusl won't become compulsory upon the mayit, the deceased again. On account of that, even though washing the deceased is compulsory, out of us honoring the deceased. Now, so he then went on to speak about this, even though we did speak about it already. He said, وَيَجِبُ عَلَى الْمَرْأَةِ مِنْ خُرُوجِ مَنِيِّهَا. Similarly, ghusl is compulsory upon a lady when she releases money. And we quoted the hadith of Sulaym in that regard. And then also, like ghusl becomes compulsory when a male inserts the male organ into that of a farj, any farj it may be. Similarly, ghusl becomes compulsory upon a lady when the male organ, a dhakar, is inserted into her, irrespective what quality that dhakar may hold. And we're going to explain that in detail. أي ذكر دخل في قبلها أو دبرها. Or ghusl will also become compulsory if a male dhakar inserts her back, from the back. And again, even though this is something that our sacred law deems to be haram, there is alternative views that were mentioned by the scholars, but the vast majority of this ummah, without khilaf, considered anal penetration to be impermissible. Now, وَلَوْ كَانَ الذَّكَرُ الَّذِي دَخَلَ, irrespective whether the dhakar, the male organ that was inserted into the lady, whether it happens to be ashal, whether it's, in other words, whether the penis is erect or not. Now, whether it happens to be the penis of a man that reached the age of puberty, or whether it happens to be the penis of a youngster. أو من صبي, even that of a, أو بهيمة, even if it's the dhakar, the male organ of an animal that inserted the private of a female, ghusl becomes compulsory. Now, so these are masail that apply to both male and female. Two asbab, khuruj al-mani and ilaj al-hashafati fi farjin. Now, those are two things that make ghusl compulsory for both male and female. Let me just see my screen. Is everybody with me? Marhaba. Sheikh, is there ikhtilaf in the Shafis on the meaning of iltiqa'ul khitanain? I don't know of any khilaf over there. I can't really see another position coming about. يعني التقاء الختانين يعني من تحاذيهما. والله أعلم. تمام. Now our author is going to get into a discussion regarding that which makes ghusl compulsory for a female specifically. فقال ومن الحيض والنفاس، يعني ويجب الغسل على المرأة من الحيض والنفاس. دليل ذلك قول الله سبحانه وتعالى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن, which is very interesting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, make i'tizal, stay away from women folk while they experiencing menstruation. Then he says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوهُنْ, do not go close to them, حَتَّى يَطْهُرْن, until they become clean. They enter into a state of purity. A state of purity means in inqita'u dam, their bleeding stops, and they perform ghusl, now they enter into a state of impurity. Shaykh Albani spread a view once upon a time, and that went against the view of all the ulama, that if a lady's bleeding stops, a man may have now conjugal relations with his wife if his wife's bleeding stopped, even before she took a ghusl. But that's a view that no scholar held. And it's sad sometimes, I'm not making specific reference now to Shaykh Nasruddin Albani. I'm just in general reference to those who adopt views that contradict the madhab and the amount of ease with which they are able to adopt such a view. If I remember correctly, this is something I read a very long time ago. He was arguing that Arabs lived in the desert and there was a scarcity of water, and it would not make sense for a woman folk, for a lady whose bleeding stopped to go perform a ghusl only to have sexual relations with her husband to perform another ghusl. Right? And on a simple, faulted reasoning such as that, one was able to push aside the views of the great Imam of the past. It's really strange. Because even if you were to assume that water was scarce, a ghusl, the Prophet ﷺ, and by extension, many of the companions, they were able to perform a ghusl with 2 liters of water. So even if water is scarce, 3 liters. What is 3 liters of water for a ghusl? And then Allah said, حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَ, until they become tahir. Inqita' al-dam does not declare a lady to be tahir. انقطاع الدم plus ghusl equals a state of tahara. But that's not what I wanted to raise. I wanted to ask the question, how does this verse tell you that ghusl becomes compulsory? This verse didn't say that يجب على المرأة الغسل من حيض أو نفاس. So the reasoning behind the verse is as follows. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that a lady cannot have sexual relations until she is clean. We also know that it's compulsory upon a lady to make herself available to a husband. كل التمكين. يجب على المرأة تمكينها لزوجها وتمكين زوجها من الوطء. If a lady doesn't make tamkeen of herself, she is considered to be nashiza, disobedient. If she is declared to be disobedient, she's not entitled to nafaqah, she's not entitled to sakan, she's not entitled to any of the rights that she is usually entitled to. Even though realistically on the ground, we teach and explain that marriages are more than rights. If marriage is just about right, then that's not a successful marriage. No. But nonetheless, since it's compulsory upon her to make herself available, she cannot truly be making herself available unless she performs ghusl. So the qaida maxim reads ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. So what's wajib? Is wajib for her to make herself available for her husband to have sexual relationships with her. As long as she has not yet performed the ghusl, she is not available. فما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. So since she cannot really make herself available to her husband, which is wajib, except by performing a ghusl, the ghusl also becomes wajib. فأتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن. And similarly, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh that when your haid arrives, إذا أقبلت الحيضة فاترك الصلاة, leave صلاة. فإذا ذهب قدرها, when the days of your haid has passed by, فاغسلي, then perform ghusl. That's الأمر, والأمر للوجوب. فاغسلي عنك الدم وصلي. And that is consensus by the scholars that haid makes ghusl compulsory. Another interesting discussion that comes here, or let's leave that discussion and move on. One nifas. Another thing that makes ghusl compulsory is nifas. Nifas, we previously stated, we may have stated previously, is postnatal bleeding. Did we cover the chapters of haid already in this class? I don't think we covered haid. No. Inshallah, in due time. Haid is a very important chapter that I want to take my time with because our women folk, there's lots of confusion with regards to haid, and many women folk are either guilty, it's haram for her to perform salah while she is unclean, and many women folk may be doing that, as how many women folk imagine themselves to be experiencing haid when they are not, and thus they're leaving our salah, which is compulsory. So haid ties into salah, and the difference between us and disbelievers is salah, and therefore especially our sisters, when we reach the chapters of haid, we need to take it seriously and go through it timelessly, inshallah ta'ala. Nonetheless, nifas is what we call postnatal bleeding. Now, so if a lady experienced nifas, then ghusl becomes compulsory upon her. Now, also what makes ghusl compulsory upon a lady is khurujul waladi, and then he added jafan, the exiting of a child. When a lady gives birth to a child, then ghusl becomes compulsory upon her. Now, a lady could give birth to a child with the child without any fluid, and that's more theoretical or hypothetical than anything else, or she could give birth with fluid. Now, if a lady gives birth with fluid, then ghusl becomes compulsory qat'an bila khilaf. If, however, she gives birth to a dry child without any fluid, then according to the rajih, ghusl becomes compulsory. Now, the fluid, in the case where she gives birth with fluid, then the fluid will make ghusl compulsory, because that fluid is similar to is treated similar to ejaculate. When she gives birth to a dry child, then there's a mawdi al khilaf. Does that make ghusl compulsory? Yes or no? The rajih is that it does make ghusl compulsory. But why would a dry child make ghusl compulsory? When it's with fluid, then it's like ejaculate, and ejaculate, we already covered the hadith from Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that makes ghusl compulsory. But what about the dry child? The reasoning there is that the child is made up of money. Whether you want to argue it's the male's money and the females mixed together, or whether you want to argue it's only the males, irrespective, ghusl becomes compulsory. Because the child is made up of money, so the child coming out is like money coming out. So if ghusl becomes compulsory with money from which the child is, if ghusl becomes compulsory with money when it exits the private, then the child that is created from that money should also make ghusl compulsory. No. He then said, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَإِنَّمَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِتَغْيِيبِ جَمِيعِ الْحَشَفَةِ. Now, so the next thing you wanted to speak of is, when we're speaking about ghusl becoming compulsory when the head of the penis inserts a private, for the male when his head inserts, the head of his penis inserts, or for the lady when a head of a dhakar inserts, then it has to be the entire hashafa, the entire head. So the head of the penis is from the beginning until the place of circumcision. That's where that's considered to be the hashafa of the male organ. Now, as for the instance where part of the hashafa enters and part of it does not enter, then that does not necessitate ghusl. That does not make ghusl compulsory. Now, if a man does not have a hashafa, let's say part of his male organ was cut off, then that which remains either equals the size of a hashafa or doesn't. If it equals the size of a hashafa or more, and the amount of his penis that enters the private is assumed to be the amount of a hashafa, then ghusl becomes wajib. Otherwise not. Otherwise not. So if a lady is penetrated with anything other than a dhakar, if it's with a dhakar, then if a hashafa enters, ghusl becomes compulsory. Any dhakar that may be, whether it's the dhakar of a human being or an animal, whether it's a baligh boy or not, ghusl becomes compulsory. What if it's not a dhakar? If a lady is penetrated with anything other than a dhakar, then ghusl does not become compulsory. Unless, of course, it leads to ejaculation. Then what makes ghusl compulsory will be ejaculation. Now, the next masala he discusses now is when somebody sees money and is uncertain whether it's his money or not. What does he do? So he said, وَلَوْ رَأَى مَنِيًّا فِي ثَوْبٍ. He sees money on his clothing, ejaculate on his clothing. أو فراش, or his bedding, wherein he sleeps. مَعَ مَنْ يُمْكِنْ كَوْنُهُ مِنْ. However, he sees it on such clothing or on such bedding that is shared with another person. And it's possible that ejaculate is coming from another person. What does he do? Does he consider ghusl to be compulsory, yes or no? ghusl does not become compulsory. Why? The asl is tahara, and there's shak about janaba or hadath. واليقين لا يزال بالشك. That's a simple masala. However, in this instance, nudiba lahuma, it's mandub, recommended for the person who saw the money on the clothing and the other person who shares the clothing with him or who shares the bedding with him to perform ghusl out of caution. This is actually a very interesting masala, because if you follow the ruling of wudu, a person that is in doubt whether he has wudu or not, and he performs wudu in that state, is his wudu valid, yes or no? No, his wudu is not valid. If I doubt whether I have wudu or not and I go ahead and I make wudu, my wudu is not valid. So here they're saying it's mandu for him to make ghusl ihtiyata. Why is the ghusl valid here but the wudu not valid there? Hey? What did you think the difference is? I'm not seeing it mentioned in the commentary I'm looking at. It's not mentioned there, but what would you imagine the difference to be? Wudu being easier. The difference is that Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. For a person to maintain conviction that he does not have wudu and thereafter to perform wudu is easy. If a person is uncertain, do I have wudu or not wudu, and he performs wudu in that state, his wudu will be invalid. Why? Because it's very easy for him just to invalidate his wudu and then to perform wudu. So invalidate your wudu, and now you know with certainty you don't have wudu, and then perform wudu. But even in the case of ghusl, how do you invalidate your ghusl? How do you purposely enter into a state of janaba? For a married man, it may be possible, but it's not easy. And for a non-married person, there's no way of doing it. And that's the difference between wudu and ghusl. So in the case of ghusl, احتياطا you perform ghusl and your ghusl will be considered valid and you continue with life. ولا يجب على واحد منهما, but it's not compulsory to perform ghusl, because it's possible that in relation to both persons, it's possible in relation to person A that the money came from person B, and it's possible in relation to person B that the money came from person A. As for a person that he's the only one wearing his clothing, or the only person that's sleeping in a particular bed, if such a person sees money or traces of money, then what should he do? Then ghusl becomes compulsory. Ghusl becomes compulsory, and he will have to repeat every salah since the last time he slept in that bed. So if he slept in the bed, he woke up, he performed Fajr and Dhuhr and Asr, and then after Isha he goes back and he sees, whoa, there are traces of money in my bed. So ghusl becomes compulsory, and he must make all those salah again. Of course, in that instance, he will not be considered sinful. Tamam. He said here that ولو رأى منيا في ثوب وفراش ينام فيه مع من يمكن كونه منه ندب لهما الغسل ولا يجب ولا يقتدي أحدهما بالآخر. They cannot follow each other in prayer hereafter as well. Person A, person B, ghusl doesn't become compulsory upon them. They shade clothing, they shade bedding. They don't know who the ejaculate comes from. So what do? They cannot follow each other in prayer. Because when I say that my yaqeen is that I had tahara, and I'm doubting whether I entered into a state of janaba, what that effectively means is I'm working on an asl that I'm in a state of tahara. And when I work on the asl that I'm in a state of tahara, I must believe that my companion is in a state of janaba. And my companion, he's working on the asl that he's in a state of tahara, which means he must believe that I'm in a state of janaba. So we cannot follow each other in salah. وَلَا يَقْتَدِي أَحَدُهُمَا بِالْآخَرِ. That's clear, right? And mean, from the conditions of following a person in prayer is that أَلَّا يَعْتَقِدْ ماذا؟ أَلَّا يَعْتَقِدْ بُطْلَانَ صَلَاةِ إِمَامِهِ. If you believe that the salah of imam is batil, then you cannot follow that imam in salah. فَإِن لَمْ يَنَمْ فِيهِ غَيْرُهُ. If no one but him sleeps in it, and he does not recollect having a wet dream, ghusl becomes compulsory upon him. Now, according to the official view of the madhab. However, Ibn Hajar, he draws a distinction. He says that a person will either see money inside of his clothing, inside referring to the side of his private, or out of his clothing. So Ibn Hajar, he says that ghusl becomes compulsory even if he finds, whether he finds money inside or on the outside. Tamam? Al-Imam al-Ramli, he said that ghusl only becomes compulsory if he finds money ejaculate on the inside of his clothing, not on the outside. Why? Because if it's on the outside, it's possible that it came from elsewhere. Now, this is like a real interesting example. It's interesting for me. Why? Because it shows you to what extent our jurists will take ihtimalat, possibilities. What on earth is the possibility of someone else ejaculate on the outside of your clothing? Right? That's the possibility is there. Ramli said that ghusl will not be compulsory upon this person. No. Then you know what they make an example of? They make an example of, listen to the ihtimal. They're saying that the milk of a khuffash, you know what a khuffash is? Who knows what a khuffash is? I'm looking at the chat here. That seems to be very quiet today. Sorry, my ankle is paining. I broke my ankle last year, Rabi al-Awwal, and it's giving me some trouble. Make dua for my ankle. I need to go see my physiotherapist again. A bat. Ahsant Fatima. They say the laban of a khuffash resembles the money of a rajul. It's possible that somehow a bat ended up on the dhahir of his clothing and excreted some laban, and that resembled sperm, and therefore it was on the dhahir, the ghusl is not compulsory upon it. Subhanallah. ويجب إعادة كل صلاة لا يحتمل حدوث المني بعدها. No. Every salah that it was not possible that money could have came about after it, that he needs to repeat that salah. So in other words, I said if he woke up Fajr and then never went back to bed, and the evening he found. However, if he slept, woke up Fajr, and then he took rest after Dhuhr, and then he woke up after Dhuhr, and then he made Asr, Maghrib, and Isha. So when he comes back to bed after Isha and finds that there's money ejaculate on his bed, then it's possible now that it could have happened Fajr time. It's possible it could have happened after Dhuhr. Now, as long as it's possible that it could have happened after Dhuhr, his Fajr and Dhuhr Salah will remain intact. And because in terms of Fajr and Dhuhr, listen what he says. He says, لا يحتمل حدوث المني بعدها. Was it possible that the money came into his bedding after Dhuhr and Asr? Yes, it was. So Dhuhr and Asr is fine. Was it possible that the money came after Asr, Maghrib, and Isha? No, not possible, because he wasn't in his bed after Maghrib, Asr, and Isha. So you'll have to make qada of those salahs. لا يحتمل حدوث المني بعدها. نعم. لكن يندب إعادة ما أمكن كونها بعده. However, it's recommended that he reperforms those salahs, those prayers. There's a possibility that the money existed in his bed prior to it. So in my example, it will be recommended for him to make qada of fajr and dhuhr, but not wajib. No. Because there's a possibility that it came, money appeared on his bedding before fajr. No. No. In the Bayan, who knows the book Al Bayan? I'm going to be reading from the Bayan now. So I just want you to know who knows Al Bayan. The Yemenis are very proud of Bayan, Al Bayan. MashaAllah, no one's answering. Where's all the students that used to have answers to all my questions?
Sheikh, I'm driving right now, so I cannot type. I know Al Bayan is, the scholar is even called Al Yemeni, huh?
He's a Yemen, Al Imrani. No. So the Yemenis are very proud of him. It's the first extensive work in the Shafi mother that was authored by a Yemeni. No, Al Imrani. We have, library in Strand, we have copies of it. I don't have a copy in my library. No. So Al Imrani in his Al Bayan, he said his expression was much more clear. So he said that وإن تحقق أن المني خرج منه في النوم ولم يعلم متى خرج منه وجب عليه أن يغتسل ووجب عليه أن يعيد كل صلاة بعد أقرب نومة نامها. When he sees that money, then it's compulsory to perform a ghusl, and it's compulsory for him to make qada of all salahs going back to his last sleep. أقرب نومة نومها, his last sleep. So his last sleep was after dhuhr, which means he was make qada of asr, maghrib and isha. Now, then he said, ويستحب له أن يعيد ما صلى من الوقت الذي تيقن أنه حدث بعده. Now, that would now include Fajr and Dhuhr. على كل حال, it's just different expressions explaining the same thing. He goes on now to speak about a lady. She had jima', and then she performed ghusl, and after she performed ghusl, the money of her husband comes out of her again. What should happen now? Should she perform ghusl, yes or no? If the money is mixed with? No. If the money is mixed with her money, then yes, otherwise not. How does she know whether it's mixed with hers or not? So she has yaqeen, she ejaculated. In which case, what does that mean? Climax. Now, so read the masala. ولو جُمِعَت, she had sexual relations. في قبلها, in her front private, of course. فاغتسلت, and then she performed the fard ghusl after she had sexual relations. ثم خرج بعد الغسل منيه. Then after she performed ghusl, the money of her husband exits from her private. منها لازمها غسل آخر. It's compulsory upon her to perform another ghusl with two conditions. What are the conditions? In short, she must have reached a climax. She herself must have reached a climax whereby it's possible for her to have ejaculated. If she did not reach a climax, and thus did not ejaculate, then she knows that the money that came out of her is purely his money, not mixed with hers. Right. If she reached ejaculate, if she reached a point of ejaculation, a climax, then it's possible that his money that left her is mixed with hers. In fact, it's almost definite that her money was mixed with his and exited from a private, which means her money also exited, and thus ghusl becomes compulsory. So how does he express this? Explaining that she ejaculated, he says, first condition, أن تكون ذات شهوة لا صغيرة. She must be a lady of desire and not a minor. Now, a lady that doesn't have desire does not ejaculate. Similarly, a صغيرة does not ejaculate. الثاني أن تكون قد قضت شهوتها. Second condition is she must have fulfilled her shahwa. She must have fulfilled her desire through jima. She should not have been a na'ima, someone that is sleeping, or a mukraha, someone that was forced. No. Because in those instances, she won't ejaculate. So when one of these conditions are missing, she either doesn't, she's not a person of shahwa, or she's a minor, that she does not ejaculate, or she did not fulfill her desire because she was either sleeping or forced, then ghusl is not compulsory. Bila khilaf, qat'an. In our fiqh, they would use the term qat'an. I just want to use this as an opportunity. Qat'an in our fiqh means what? We translate it usually as categorically. Categorically would mean bila khilaf. No. There's no khilaf on the masala. Now, so a question that I have in my mind, that you should also have in your mind, is that when his money leaves her after she took a ghusl, the fact that she had money that exited the private with his money, that should be an ihtimal. That's an ihtimal. It's shak. It's not yaqeen. When his money comes out of it, there's no yaqeen. So if she had tahara based on the ghusl, and now there's doubt whether her money exited with his money, why is that ghusl compulsory? Is the qaida not al-yaqeen la yuzalu bi-shak? So how would you respond? The fact that she fulfilled her desire still does not necessitate yaqeenan. The fact that she ejaculated does not necessitate yaqeenan that when his money comes out of her after ghusl, that her money came out with his. And the answer to that question is that the scholars say that it's a madhinna. It's a place where her money is expected to. When his money inserts her, it's expected that there's supposed to be some type of a mixture, and therefore when his money comes out, her money is coming out with his money. This is similar to an example of what? Of nawm. When a person sleeps, when I go to sleep, غير ممكن مقعدتي من الأرض. Why is my wudu broken? When I went to sleep, I had yaqeen that I had wudu. When I went while sleeping, there's shak whether I actually released flatulence or not. So when I had doubt whether I released flatulence while asleep, why should my wudu be broken when I went to sleep? Because we said that an-nawmu madhinnat khuruj al-hadath. The sleeping is a place where it is generally expected that a person releases flatulence. So similarly over here, it's a madhinna that her money will exit with that of her husband's. Now, of course, this all applies to when a lady had sexual intercourse in the front private. If she had anal intercourse, then and money was to come out of her back private, then ghusl will not become compulsory upon her after she had made a ghusl. Again, this is a theory discussed. This is not a license to do so. Our scholars have unanimously, close to unanimous, agree that this is something which is impermissible. Now, tamam. Our author now is going to get into a discussion what exactly is money, the definition of money, and the qualities of money. Can we cover it now or not? And madhi and all other types of liquids that comes from a male or female. But I will address that in our next class, inshallah ta'ala. And with that, we'll be discussing those things that are haram upon a lady or a male that is in a state of hadath akbar. And there's some important discussions that we need to have over there, inshallah ta'ala. Are there any questions before I conclude?
Can I ask audibly, Ustaz?
Bismillah, Habib.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ustaz, welcome back from the
Marhaba.
journey. Now, referring to the other, that referring back to the other terms that you were using, that categorically, meaning qat'an, does this refer to only within our madhab, meaning to our Shafi madhab, or this categorically refers to the within four schools of thought?
Now, in our Shafi'i books, when they say qat'an, then it means bila khilaf in our madhab, not necessarily without khilaf in all madhab. Now, if it was something that is bila khilaf in all madhahib, then they would use the term ijma', bil ijma'. So qat'an, sometimes it could be referring to an ijma', meaning there's no difference of opinion among the madhahib, but the default is it only refers to our madhab, even though there's a possibility that it may refer to no khilaf in other madhab as well. But that's not always, so it's rather better to assume it just to be in the Shafi madhab.
Shukran jazeelan, Ustaz.
Muhammad Umar Mustafa, Assalamu alaikum. How is someone with waswas supposed to understand the hadith da'ma yaribuk ila ma la yaribuk and inna al-halala bayyin wa inna al-harama bayyin? They're supposed to understand it in what sense? In the context that halal is clear and haram is clear, and the area of waswas is also clear. Someone with waswas, someone that experiences waswasa, our attitude towards that person must be harsh. It's the page effect. If a page is folded this way, then in order to bring the page back to the center, if I fold the page back to the center, it's going to fall that way again. If I want the page to remain straight, I need to bend the page all the way back that way over in order to bring that balance again. So generally, depending on the nature of waswasa, if somebody says he washed his right arm, then he's washing his left arm, then he's doubting, did I wash my right arm in wudu? That person, you tell him, when you find yourself washing your left arm, it's haram for you to go back to your right arm. And you're going to be guilty of wasting water. And you adopt the strictest view and impress it upon that person, so that person just ignores his waswasa. You need to bring that person to a stage where he's ignoring his waswasa. If you don't bring him to that stage, he's going to be troubled with it for the rest of his life, and it will continue. Waswasa is when shaitan instills within a person fake piety. He makes a person worry, my state in Allah, I must make wudu right, my salah, what's going to happen to me? That's not real piety. It's a fake piety that shaitan instills within a person so that he can bring about confusion in his life. And therefore, our stance regarding people who suffer from waswasa must be very strict and harsh, and to the point, you don't do this. if you're going to listen to your waswasa, you're going against what scholars have to say, what the imam have to say. So you're having more faith in a whispering in yourself over that of the ulama. You use whatever mediums you can to do this to the page, so that if he constantly does that for a time, ignores the waswa, ignores it, eventually he'll come straight and become balanced. Na'am, wallah subhanahu wa ta'ala alam. Our next Umdah class will be on Thursday, that's correct. When we meet on Wednesday, we're continuing with Lubbul Usul, inshallah, tabaraka wa ta'ala. If there's no questions, we're going to conclude. Allah grant us tawfiq and understanding. Please do message the other students. Now, Amir, I'm going to send me the question again in next week's class, on Thursday's class, and I will address it, inshallah ta'ala. So may Allah grant us tawfiq and understanding. Allah accept our gathering and accept our class, and make us all students of knowledge. The pious scholars. بهذه النوايا بمعنى وسلفنا صالح من سيد الحاج عمر إلى حضرة النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. الفاتحة. سبحان ربك رب العزة. Muhammad Umar Mustafa. That shouldn't be a problem, but if you can first share with me what you would like to share with others, that would be preferred, inshallah. We meet on Wednesday with Lubbul Usul. Sharafuddin, I wanted to ask you, where are you from? Are you there, Sayyidi? Khair. Bitawfiq, may Allah accept. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.